Good evening, good afternoon, good morning. Today it was swearing in of councillors in many areas in Zimbabwe. This is interesting in the sense that on Monday was the swearing in of the state president. The opposition, in line with many SADC countries and many other countries in Africa and the world over, had boycotted Mnangagwa's swearing in because those elections were flawed, so flawed that they could not produce a legitimate government. The interesting thing about it is opposition, the country's main opposition party in Zimbabwe, joined in that. And they described the event as a non-event. And none of the leading opposition CCC party members attended that swearing-in ceremony. And yet, 2 days later, they are participating in the swearing-in ceremony of those CCC leaders who managed to win seats in the flawed election process. It just doesn't make sense. So what exactly has changed here? Why is it that on Monday you were agreeing with the rest of the world, and rightly so too, that the election was so flawed, so illegal, they could not possibly produce a legitimate government? And yet, when you get to benefit from the system, all of a sudden it's okay. It's amazing. CCC, the party, has issued a statement actually, presumably to explain its duplicity on this matter. And it has produced a document which explains why the party is taking this position. And here it is. That's their explanation for it. The position of the party remains as articulated at the press conference on the 29th of August 2023. That is, number one, we reject the election results because they did not meet our domestic laws and SADC guidelines and principles. So they reject the electoral process. Number two, because of the above, we are calling for fresh elections underwritten and supervised by SADC and the AU. Two, wherever we won under very difficult circumstances, it shows our resolve and tenacity as a party, and we will continue to occupy such spaces and regard such as liberated zones. In other words, they'll participate in the swearing-in ceremonies and take up their seats on the gravy train, under the pretext that these are liberated zones. Four, will embark on diplomatic offensive as well as taking political action. The above sums the broad party position What we should also remember is that we are controlling 33 out of 34 towns and cities, and the swearing of them is also pending. The swearing in is for all who were declared by ZEC as winners and will not retard our fight for free elections. It really is unbelievable the way this party, CCC, keep shifting the goalposts to suit itself. They are now accepting the swearing in of MPs and councillors because the party did win a few seats in those areas, but are dismissing the whole process as illegitimate. This has always been the contradiction with CCC. They have participated in these elections out of greed. That is the bottom line. The bottom line that we cannot deny. And they've always tried to deceive people by pretending that they're participating to do us a favor, when in reality, then of course they're not. So if we were to go back to today, this gentleman who is being sworn in here is David Coulthard.
Do swear that I will well and truly serve. Do swear that I will well and truly serve City Council in the office of Councillor.
City Council in the office of Councillor.
So help me God.
So help me God.
He is the same David Coulthard that I've quoted on a number of occasions in my presentations. He is the same guy who wrote in his book after the 2013 elections that the 2013 election process was so flawed, so illegal, that the only logical step was to withdraw, which would have compelled the SADC to hold the ZANU-PF to account. But such was the distrust between MDCT and MDCN. These were the two factions of the MDC that were in the GNU. And since then, most of them have merged to form the CCC. So to continue, such was the distrust between MDCT and MDCN that neither could withdraw for fear the other would remain in the elections, winning seats and giving the process credibility. This was soon after the 2013 elections. The electoral process has not changed. It has remained flawed and illegal. And SADC has just actually confirmed that. And yet, the CCC politicians, their greed has not changed either. They not only participated in these flawed and illegal elections this year, but they are willing to give the process that had just been declared flawed, and so flawed and illegal that it doesn't produce any legal winners, they are still prepared to take up their seats on the gravy train and give that process some legitimacy out of greed. It's absolutely unbelievable. We in Zimbabwe, we are caught between the rock and the hard place. On the other hand, we've got the vote rigging ZANU-PF, tyrannical, corrupt, incompetent. And on the other, we have got the opposition, whom the people of Zimbabwe have elected in good faith that they will implement the democratic reforms to end the ZANU-PF dictatorship. But that has not happened. During the GNU, when they had the golden opportunity to implement those reforms, the MDCT leaders sold out and failed to implement even one meaningful reform. I've often wondered how they would have explained their participation in the GNU, their failure to implement even one democratic reform during the GNU. I've read David Coulter's book. His book covers the GNU, but he conveniently skipped that bit. He never explained why is it that CCC failed to implement even one meaningful reform during that period. To be quite honest, the explanation is actually obvious, but was made very clear during the GNU. It was no secret. I remember at one point when some of the ZANU-PF cronies were asked, why is it that CCC are not implementing any reforms? And they boasted that Mazwane MDC aziza kuchikanyerere. In other words, MDC leaders have learned to enjoy the gravy train, the benefits of the gravy train. They will never rock the boat. That is true. Mugabe bribed the MDC leaders during the GNU with the ministerial limos, the generous salaries and allowances, including the US 60,000 allowance to buy a car and US 40,000 to buy a house. And God knows all the other benefits that they get as well. And for Morgan Tsvangirai, that's when he got his $4 million mansion. And with their snouts in the feeding trough, they forgot all about reforms completely. And so we have found ourselves stuck in this situation where these guys have been trapped in that greed. They failed to implement even one reform during that golden opportunity to do so during the GNU. And ever since, they've participated in these flawed and illegal elections out of greed. As David Coulter admitted there, they knew the process is flawed. They knew that participating will give ZANU-PF legitimacy, but they still continue to participate out of greed. It reminds me so much of George Orwell's book Animal Farm. I think we have reached a point now where our opposition leaders are no more than the pigs in Animal Farm. They are turning around and telling the ordinary Zimbabweans they are participating in these elections and doing the ordinary people a favor. And even when the election process have been declared flawed and illegal and cannot produce any meaningful government, legal government, they are prepared to participate in that legal government under the pretext that they are holding the liberated zones. Of course, they are not. This is no more different than the pigs saying to the rest of the animals, they are drinking the milk and eating all the apples because this food is good for the pig's brain. They themselves actually don't like it, but since they are the brains behind the farm's activities, they're being forced to eat it for the benefit of the farm. I think that's where we have reached now. We had an opposition that people risked life and limb to elect for the purpose of implementing the democratic reforms and ending the ZANU-PF dictatorship. But when they got into power, Mugabe bribed them with the benefits, with the trappings of high office. They not only forgot about the reforms, but they've given up on reforms. And they've been participating in these flawed elections, sometimes having to hide the real reason for their participation was greed by pretending they've devised ways of winning rigged elections. Up to a few days before voting day, CCC still claimed that they've plugged all the vote rigging loopholes. And their wildebeest followers who followed them blindly have not even asked what happened. The party is now admitting that the elections were rigged. They've asked them, what happened to your promise that you plugged all the vote rigging loopholes? They never asked. I honestly expected that the opposition would at least have the decency to side with SADC and the AU. Once SADC and the AU had declared these elections are so flawed, so illegal, they could not produce a legitimate government. The least corrupt and incompetent and greedy opposition should have done is all up and say, no, we can't participate in these elections and undermine SADC and the AU's position. Instead, they decided to participate. It really confirms that position, that they are participating in these flawed elections out of greed, pure and simple. They really don't care that the elections are flawed. They really don't care that millions of ordinary Zimbabweans are being denied a meaningful vote in these elections. They really don't care that by participating in these flawed elections, they are perpetuating the ZANU-PF dictatorship. They're perpetuating the people's suffering. They don't care. All they want is a share of the spoils of power. And ZANU-PF has been very good at that. In fact, after 2018, Mnangagwa created this animal called pollard, which is basically designed to reward all the opposition parties who participate in these flawed elections in the presidential race and come out and endorse the process as free, fair, and credible. They get some of these pollard frisbees. Last time they got a twin cab truck and a few other benefits. At one time, they were talking of giving some of these pollard members diplomatic passports. Who could say no to that? And if it was not for the fact that the nomination fees for the presidential candidate had been increased to a breathtaking 20,000 US dollars, I think we would have had a lot more presidential candidates this year. And if SADC and the AU had done what they've done in the past, turn a blind eye to ZANU-PF's blatant cheating and rigging, and concluded that the elections were substantially free, fair, and credible, I think right now we would have had most of those presidential candidates publicly endorsing Mnangagwa as the winner of the election, and they would have been pollard. We have got to stop this cycle, this nonsense. CCC are no more than just the pigs in Animal Farm, trying to convince us that they are doing us a big favor by participating in these flawed elections. I would like to hear Chamisa explain how they did the country a favor by failing to implement even one meaningful reform during the GNU. Because the situation there was more clear-cut than it is now. There is absolutely no other rational explanation why CCC, MDC failed to implement even one meaningful reform in 5 years of the GNU, other than that Mugabe bribed them. And with their snouts in the feeding trough, they forgot all about reforms. It is, I repeat, an outrage that after SADC and the AU had condemned these elections as a farce, we still have our own opposition undermining that decision by taking up their seats on the gravy train. The biggest problem we had during the last GNU 2008 to 2013 is that many Zimbabweans out there took a backseat. They never commented on what was going on during the GNU. SADC, to be fair to them, did try to push MDC to implement the democratic reforms. Particularly, South Africa's Minister, Lindiwe Zulu. She did her best. But she was ignored. MDC leaders were so busy enjoying the benefits of being on the gravy train, they forgot about the reforms. And we, ordinary Zimbabweans, never really came out loud and clear that we wanted the reforms to be implemented. We never supported SADC in their push to have the reforms implemented. We must not repeat that mistake. This time, we must be at the front. We must be the ones pushing for the second GNU, which is the only way we're going to get the reforms implemented. And in the second GNU, we must insist that we want to see people who are competent to implement the democratic reforms. The number one task during the last GNU was to implement the democratic reforms. But I think very few ordinary Zimbabweans out there even understood that. We must understand that now. We must also understand that both ZANU-PF and CCC leaders were in that last GNU, and they failed to implement even one meaningful reform. It is absolutely ridiculous that we are now can expect the same individuals to be in the second GNU. What confidence we have that they will implement any reforms? If they fail to implement even one meaningful reform in 5 years of the last GNU, what hope is there that they will implement any? In fact, according to CCC's position, party position that I read earlier on, all they want is fresh elections supervised by SADC and the AU. They don't even mention any reforms. Even if SADC and the AU was to supervise those elections, without reforms, it will mean SADC and the AU have got to supervise the next elections too, because there's nothing that will stop ZANU-PF particularly reverting back to the old system, and we're back to the flawed elections again. That is one thing that Zimbabwe can ill afford. We have the golden opportunity, a second chance to get the reforms implemented. We failed to do so in the first GNU. Now we've got a second chance. And if we miss this chance, we may not get another chance for a generation. Even if it's for 10 years of this corrupt, incompetent, failed state, how many people will suffer. The longer we delay implementing the reforms, the harder it's going to be to revive the Zimbabwe economy. It is already going to be an uphill task to do that. The country's infrastructure is in tatters. Some of our education, most of our students have been so poorly educated to the point where it's really a lost generation. How do you build a prosperous country within a poorly educated population? Those are the challenges that the government, once we have finally got ourselves back on track with good governance, will have to face. But before we can start talking about how to improve, how to rebuild the country, we must get it back on the democratic path. And the only way we're going to do it is to have a second government of national unity and make sure that competent men and women are appointed to implement the reforms. Because without implementing those reforms, the country is going nowhere. And at the present moment, neither ZANU-PF No, the opposition CCC deserve to be in the second GNU. They are part of the problem. How can they be part of the solution too? Thank you very much and good night.